My mom thought she could replace my father with her creepy new boyfriend and make me call him dad, but she didn't realize I still had contact with my actual dad. I was 13 when my mother got engaged to Brandon. Dad had been convicted for manslaughter 5 months ago. He called someone at the bar, but he wasn't even drinking. I was there with him. He went into the bathroom, then came out minutes later looking panicked and covered in blood. He shouted for someone to call the police, and they arrived quickly. But then without saying much, they put him in handcuffs and took him away. The next time I saw him was behind bars. It never made much sense though. Dad never had a violent bone in his body. He swore he didn't do it. And the way Mom acted after his conviction made me even more suspicious. She brought home Brandon instantly. On day 1, she said he was my new dad since the other one was clearly a monster, and told me that my dad was a killer who I needed to distance from for my own safety. I wasn't sure what to believe at first, but when 5 months later my mom announced to me that they were engaged and I needed to start calling Brandon daddy, I became quite convinced of Dad's innocence. Around this time is also when it started. Brandon got comfortable. He began staring at me while eating slowly, saying things like, "You're growing up so fast, becoming such a pretty young woman." The worst part was my mom thought it was sweet. Even when I told my mom for the first time that Brandon made my skin crawl, she told me I was dramatic. She must have told him what I said though, because that night while she slept, Brandon came into my room, and he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks and said, "You know what happens to naughty girls who snitch." I was terrified, but I knew I couldn't trust my mom by telling her, so I kept it a secret. I also started keeping a different secret around this time. I started writing letters to Dad. I'd hide them between my textbook pages and mail them from my friend's house after school. Dad would write back through the prison email system to an account I created without Mom knowing. Things got really bad one specific Thursday though. I came home from school one day to find out Mom had changed my last name on all school records to Brandon's without telling me. "You'll thank me when you're older," she said. That night Brandon came into my room to celebrate being a real family now, and sat on my bed. He put his hand on my thigh and said I should be grateful to have a dad who cares. I pushed him off and locked myself in the bathroom until he left. I remember writing to Dad about that incident. The letter I got back from him was on real paper this time, and parts of it were damp and see-through, almost as if he had cried while writing it. That almost broke me. But luckily there was one thing I looked forward to, the chance to see him. His birthday was coming up, and I remember enthusiastically asking Mom if I could visit him. I told her I knew she didn't like him, but it was his birthday, just today, and for a few minutes. "Please," I said. But of course I got told no. Actually, I got told something even worse. Mom said we couldn't go because that exact weekend Brandon coincidentally had car show tickets and expected us all to go together. He specifically requested us to have adjoining hotel rooms. When I told them I'd rather visit Dad, Mom exploded. "He's a killer! You're not visiting a murderer!" When I said, "He's innocent and he's still my dad," Brandon backhanded me across the face while Mom watched. She said nothing. I was forced to go with them that weekend, and while I was sleeping, the worst happened. Brandon snuck in. He was drunk, and this time he didn't restrain himself to just a thigh grab. His hand went all the way. I had never felt so disgusting and humiliated. I remember traveling home broken. And to make matters even worse, the week we came home, my mom found the hidden letters from Dad I had been hiding. She burned them in the backyard, and as punishment for communicating with him, she took my bedroom door off its hinges for monitoring. Of course, Brandon took this as an opportunity. He would stand in the doorway at night watching me sleep. I remember that was a real breaking point of mine. I remember sneaking off into the school library past hours the next day to email DDA. I must have sent an hour-long email that made no sense because I just rambled about everything. I didn't know what I expected, if I even wanted anything because I was so numb. But then 2 weeks later, I got a reply from him. It was lengthy, super lengthy, telling me all the right things and how everything was going to be okay. But there was one thing that stuck out. "Did you check where I said?" I became confused. Check where? I started going through every single email he had ever sent me, and that's when I found it. In one of the more recent emails, Dad had told me to go up to the attic and behind the radiator. I remember reading that email the day after asking my mom if I could go visit him. I think I was too heartbroken to read thoroughly, and somehow missed it. Either way, I made a big-time mental note of what Dad said, and waited until Mom and Brandon went on date night. That happened next week. My hands shook climbing into the attic with a flashlight, and behind the radiator, I found a plastic-wrapped journal. I opened it to the marked page Dad told me to. It was dated weeks before Dad's arrest, and in Dad's handwriting it said, "It's been a few weeks since I caught Lauren and Brandon sneaking off into the bar. I don't know how to confront her." I was shocked, taken aback, and that's when I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway that made my blood run cold. They were back early. The restaurant must have been too crowded, or maybe they'd had a fight. I could hear car doors slamming and Mom's heels clicking on the walkway. My heart pounded as I clutched the journal to my chest, knowing I had only seconds to decide what to do. I heard Brandon's heavy footsteps on the stairs, each creak of the old wood sending a jolt through my chest. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the flashlight, its beam dancing wildly across the dusty attic floorboards. I shoved the journal under my shirt, the leather cover cold against my skin, and scrambled toward the attic opening, but I was too slow. Brandon's head appeared through the hole just as I reached the ladder, his dark eyes immediately locking onto mine. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Then he climbed up the rest of the way, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the opening. I backed up against the wall, feeling the rough wood press into my spine, the journal pressing against my stomach under my shirt. He looked around the attic slowly, deliberately, taking in the disturbed dust that hung in the air like tiny ghosts, the moved boxes near the radiator where I'd found Dad's hidden things. He asked what I was doing up here, his voice calm, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. I told him I was looking for my old stuffed animals from when I was little, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't believe me. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands flexed at his sides. He stepped closer, and I could smell the wine on his breath from dinner, mixed with his cologne that Mom said was expensive but always made me feel sick. He said I was a terrible liar, just like my father. The words hit me like a slap. Then he grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, and yanked me toward the ladder. I had to use my other hand to keep the journal from falling out of my shirt, pressing it tight against my body. Mom was waiting at the bottom of the ladder, her arms crossed and foot tapping impatiently. She looked annoyed, asking why I was sneaking around like some kind of thief in my own house. Brandon told her I was probably hiding something, his hand still gripping my arm possessively. He suggested they search my room, and I saw a flash of something dark in his eyes. I panicked and said I just wanted to find my old teddy bear because I couldn't sleep without my door. The words tumbled out too fast, too desperate. Mom rolled her eyes but seemed to buy it, probably because she was tired and didn't want to deal with more drama. That night I waited until I heard them both snoring, Brandon's deep rumble mixing with Mom's softer breathing. The house settled into its nighttime creaks and groans as I carefully hid the journal inside my pillowcase, feeling the corners dig into my cheek when I lay down. I couldn't risk reading more with Brandon checking on me every hour, his shadow appearing in my doorway like clockwork. The next morning was Saturday. Mom made pancakes like nothing had happened, humming off-key to some song on the radio. The normalcy of it made my stomach turn. Brandon kept staring at me across the table, his eyes following every movement as I pushed food around my plate. I excused myself to use the bathroom and took the journal with me, hiding it in the tank of the toilet wrapped in a plastic bag I found under the sink. The water was cold on my arms as I carefully placed it inside. At school on Monday, I snuck into the computer lab during lunch, telling my friends I had to finish an assignment. The room was empty except for the hum of old computers and the tick of the wall clock. I started taking photos of each page of the journal with my phone, angling it to avoid the glare from the fluorescent lights. My hands were still shaking, making some photos blurry. The entries went back years, Dad's familiar handwriting becoming more frantic as time went on. Dad wrote about his suspicions, about seeing Brandon's car at weird hours parked down the street, about Mom acting strange and distant. One entry mentioned finding a receipt for a motel in Mom's purse when he was looking for gum. Another talked about Brandon showing up at the bar during Dad's shifts, always watching from a corner booth, always lurking like a predator studying its prey. I uploaded everything to a cloud account I made with a fake name, my heart pounding as the progress bar slowly filled. Then I deleted the photos from my phone, checking twice to make sure they were really gone. I knew Brandon might check it. He'd been going through my things more lately. When I got home that day, he was waiting in my room, sitting on my bed like he owned the place. He'd gone through everything. My drawers were dumped out, clothes scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. My mattress was flipped, the box spring exposed. Even my old jewelry box was emptied, cheap necklaces and friendship bracelets tangled together. He asked where it was, his voice dangerously quiet. I played dumb, asking what he was talking about, trying to look confused instead of terrified. He grabbed my shoulders and shook me hard, my teeth clicking together. He said he knew I found something in the attic, that he wasn't stupid. Mom came home then, her keys jingling as she called out hello. She asked what was going on, surveying the destruction of my room with raised eyebrows. Brandon smoothly lied, his entire demeanor changing in an instant. He said he was helping me reorganize my messy room, that I'd asked for his help. He even smiled, that fake smile that never reached his eyes. She believed him like always, probably because it was easier than asking questions. That night at dinner, Brandon announced they were moving up the wedding. Instead of next year, it would be next month. He said he couldn't wait any longer to make our family official. Mom squealed with excitement, clapping her hands like a child. I felt sick, the chicken on my plate suddenly looking gray and unappetizing. Over the next few weeks, Brandon watched me constantly. He installed a camera in the hallway pointing at where my door used to be, the red light blinking at me like an evil eye. He started driving me to and from school, no more bus with my friends. He'd wait in the parking lot, engine running, watching everyone who talked to me. He took my phone at night, placing it on his nightstand where I couldn't reach it. But I kept working during the day. I printed pages from the journal at school and hid them in my locker, taping them behind old textbooks. I needed help but didn't know who to trust. My teachers seemed oblivious. My friends wouldn't understand. Then I remembered Uncle Henry. He was Dad's best friend since high school, the kind of guy who showed up to help without being asked. They'd been inseparable until Dad's arrest. Mom had banned him from contacting us after that, saying he was a bad influence, that he enabled Dad's violent tendencies. But I knew that was a lie. Uncle Henry was a good man who smelled like sawdust, and always had butterscotch candies in his pocket. He worked construction, and had 3 kids of his own, twin boys and a little girl who called me her big cousin. I found his number in an old address book Mom had forgotten about in the kitchen junk drawer, buried under expired coupons and dead batteries. I called him from the payphone outside school during PE class, the metal cold against my ear. I told the teacher I felt sick and needed air, clutching my stomach for effect. Uncle Henry answered on the 3rd ring, his gruff voice softening when I said who I was. I talked fast, words tumbling over each other, telling him I needed help, that Dad was innocent, that I had proof. He told me to slow down, to breathe. Then he said to meet him at the public library after school the next day. He'd tell my mom he saw me walking and offered a ride if she asked. His voice was steady, reassuring, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe things would be okay. Brandon was suspicious when I said I was staying late for a group project. He grilled me about who was in my group, what the project was about, which teacher assigned it. But my history teacher backed me up when he called to check, probably annoyed at being bothered during her planning period. I practically ran to the library, my backpack bouncing against my spine. Uncle Henry was waiting in the parking lot in his old pickup truck. The red paint faded but clean. He looked older than I remembered, with more gray in his beard and deeper lines around his eyes. I showed him photos of the journal entries on my phone, swiping through them quickly. His face got darker with each one, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He said he always knew something was off about Dad's arrest. The story never made sense. Too many holes, too convenient. He asked if I still had the actual journal. I told him where I hid it, and he nodded approvingly. He said we needed more than just Dad's suspicions. We needed real evidence, witnesses, something concrete. He knew some people who worked at the bar that night. Maybe they saw something, remembered something the police didn't bother to ask about. Over the next 2 weeks, I met Uncle Henry at the library 3 more times. Each meeting felt like a spy movie, checking over my shoulder, taking different routes. He'd tracked down Edward, who was working security that night. Edward was a big guy with kind eyes who remembered everything. He remembered Brandon being there, which was weird because Brandon had told police he was home all evening watching TV. Edward said he saw Brandon go into the bathroom right before Dad, maybe 30 seconds. seconds. But Edward had been too scared to speak up after Dad got arrested so fast, afraid of getting involved, afraid of Brandon, who had connections everywhere. Uncle Henry also found Carolyn, who was bartending that night. She had curly red hair and a sharp memory for faces. She said Brandon had been coming around for weeks before the incident, always asking about Dad's schedule, pretending to be friendly. She thought it was strange but didn't think much of it at the time. People asked about regulars all the time. She remembered Brandon ordering a drink that night, a whiskey neat, then disappearing for a while before the body was found. She'd been the one to call 911, her hands shaking so bad she could barely dial. The breakthrough came when Uncle Henry talked to Brian, who managed the bar. Brian was an older guy who'd run the place for 20 years. Brian mentioned they'd upgraded their security system a month before the incident. The police had only taken the main camera footage, but there was a backup system that recorded the hallway to the bathrooms. Brian still had those files on an old hard drive in his office. He'd forgotten about them until Uncle Henry asked, the drive gathering dust behind old liquor invoices. We met at Brian's house to watch the footage. His living room smelled like cigarettes and coffee. My stomach was in knots as Brian connected the drive to his laptop. The timestamp showed Brandon entering the bathroom at 9:47 p.m., walking casually like he had all the time in the world. Dad entered at 9:52 p.m., probably just needing to use the bathroom after his shift. Brandon came out at 9:51 p.m., checking his watch and smoothing down his shirt. Dad came out at 9:53 p.m. covered in blood, shouting for help, his face a mask of shock and horror. It was clear as day. Brandon had 4 minutes alone in that bathroom, more than enough time to call someone and set up a frame job. Uncle Henry copied the footage onto multiple USB drives, his hands steady and methodical. He said we needed to be careful about how we handled this. We couldn't just go to the police. Brandon might have connections there, friends who owed him favors. We needed to build an airtight case first. He told me to act normal at home, not to let on that we knew anything. It was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. But Brandon must have sensed something. Maybe I was a bad actress. Maybe he was just paranoid. He started getting more aggressive. One night he came into my room and sat on my bed, the mattress dipping under his weight. The hallway camera couldn't see him from that angle. He said he knew I'd been sneaking around with Uncle Henry. Someone had seen us at the library, probably one of his buddies who seemed to be everywhere. He said if I didn't stop whatever I was doing, Mom might get hurt. He said accidents happen all the time, his voice casual like he was discussing the weather. People fall downstairs, cars have brake problems, gas leaks happen. I understood the threat, felt it settle in my chest like a cold stone. I was terrified but tried to stay calm, keeping my breathing even. I told Uncle Henry at our next meeting, whispering even though we were alone. He said we needed to move faster. He'd been in touch with Dad's lawyer, showing him what we'd found. The lawyer was excited but cautious. He said we needed the original journal too. It would strengthen the case, prove the photos weren't doctored. I told him I'd get it, even though the thought made me want to throw up. That night I waited until 3 a.m., watching the clock's red numbers change with agonizing slowness. I crept to the bathroom, my bare feet silent on the carpet. I carefully retrieved the journal from the toilet tank, the plastic still protecting it. It was still dry in its plastic wrapping. Dad's words safe. I put it in my backpack for school, zipping it into the inner pocket. But when I came out of the bathroom, Brandon was standing in the hallway like a ghost. He asked what I was doing up, his eyes glinting in the darkness. I said I felt sick, holding my stomach. He stared at me for a long moment, then let me pass. I felt his eyes on my back all the way to my room. The next morning, my backpack was gone. I found it in the kitchen, empty, its contents spread across the table. Brandon was sitting at the table with the journal in front of him, flipping through pages with theatrical interest. Mom was reading it, her face pale and confused. Brandon had told her I'd been writing fantasy stories about him, that I was disturbed, that I needed help. He'd started pointing out specific entries, saying, "Look how she's trying to copy your husband's handwriting. See how she mentions you and me together? This is clearly her sick fantasy about breaking us up." Mom's confusion turned to anger as Brandon kept talking, weaving his lies with just enough truth to make them believable. Mom believed him. She said she was disappointed in me, that making up lies about Brandon was sick, that she thought I was dealing with Dad's absence better than this. I tried to tell her it was Dad's journal, but she wouldn't listen. She said I was obviously forging Dad's handwriting to frame Brandon, because I couldn't accept him as my new father. She said I needed therapy, maybe even a special boarding school for troubled teens. Brandon suggested his cousin ran one in another state. Very strict, very isolated. Good for fixing problem children who told lies and caused trouble. The way he said it made my blood run cold. I felt the walls closing in, the room spinning slightly. That day at school I found Uncle Henry's truck in the parking lot at lunch. I climbed in and broke down crying as I told him what happened. He said not to worry, we still had the footage. But when I got home that afternoon, my phone was missing from my backpack. Brandon had it. He went through everything and found my cloud account, guessing the password after 3 tries. He made me watch as he deleted all the journal photos, his finger stabbing at the screen with vicious satisfaction. He said Uncle Henry's copies wouldn't matter without the original to verify them against. He said the photos could be faked, that any decent lawyer would argue they were doctored without the original journal to compare the handwriting. The bar footage was different. That was from an official security system with timestamps that could be verified. But handwriting in photos? Too easy to forge. That night, Mom told me I was leaving for boarding school on Monday. This special place would help me deal with my delusions about Brandon. She'd already called the school. They were expecting me. It was 1,000 miles away in the mountains. No phones allowed. No outside contact for the first 6 months to avoid negative influences. I realized this was Brandon's plan to shut me up for good, to make me disappear without actually calling me. I managed to slip out Saturday morning when Mom went grocery shopping and Brandon was in the shower. I could hear the water running as I eased open the front door. I ran to Ashley's house and used her phone to call Uncle Henry. Ashley's mom was at work and Ashley covered for me, bless her. I told him about the boarding school. He said to pack a bag and meet him at the library in an hour. But when I got back home, Brandon was waiting on the front steps, his hair still damp. He'd noticed I was gone. He dragged me inside by my hair, my scalp burning. Mom wasn't back yet. He threw me against the wall hard enough to knock a picture frame down and said I'd ruined everything. He said he'd worked too hard to let a bratty kid destroy his plans. He said Dad deserved to rot in prison, that he'd been planning this for months before that night at the bar. He said Mom was easy to manipulate, so desperate for attention after Dad started working 2 jobs to pay off the mortgage. I asked him why he called that man in the bathroom, needing to hear him say it. Brandon laughed, an ugly sound. He said the guy was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Brandon had gone in there to plant a bloody knife he'd prepared, one that would have Dad's prints on it from the kitchen at home. But the hammered guy saw him placing it near the sink and started asking questions, getting too close. So Brandon had to silence him, quick and messy, using that same knife. Then when Dad came in minutes later to help, it was perfect. The blood was fresh, Dad's prints got on everything when he tried to help the victim, tried to stop the bleeding, and in the chaos, Brandon pocketed the actual murder weapon and left a different knife at the scene, one he'd also prepared but that wouldn't trace back to him. I was recording everything on Ashley's phone that I'd hidden in my pocket, the record button pressed before I even walked in. Brandon didn't notice. He was too busy ranting about how smart he'd been, how he'd worn gloves, how he'd studied the bar's schedule for weeks. He said after Dad was gone, marrying Mom was just smart business. She had good life insurance from her job at the hospital, and I'd be worth even more in Social Security if something happened to her. Maybe a car accident, maybe a fall, maybe she'd just get sad and take too many pills. That's when Mom walked in. She'd come back early because she forgot her wallet. She heard everything Brandon had just said. Her face went white as paper. She dropped the groceries, oranges rolling across the floor. Brandon spun around, realizing his mistake. He tried to backtrack, saying I'd made him angry, that he didn't mean it, that he was just trying to scare me straight. But Mom had heard enough. The veil had finally lifted. Brandon stepped toward her and she backed away, her hand reaching behind her. She told him to get out. He said she was overreacting. She grabbed a kitchen knife from the block and told him to leave or she'd call the police. Brandon laughed and said she wouldn't dare. Too much scandal, too much shame. What would the neighbors think? But Mom's hand was steady as she held the knife. For the first time in months, I saw the Mom I used to know, the one who protected me from nightmares and kissed scraped knees. Brandon realized she was serious. His face changed, the mask finally dropping completely. He grabbed his keys and wallet from the counter, but before leaving, he turned to Mom and said this wasn't over. He said he knew too much about her, about the affairs she'd had before Dad when they were first married, about the money she'd stolen from Dad's savings to cover her shopping debts. He said if she went to the police, he'd destroy her reputation. Then he left, slamming the door so hard the windows shook and the remaining pictures fell off the walls. Mom collapsed on the floor crying, her body shaking with sobs. I sat next to her and showed her the recording on Ashley's phone. She listened to Brandon's confession again, her face crumbling more with each word. She kept saying she was sorry, that she'd been so stupid, that she'd failed me and Dad both. I told her we needed to call the police now, but she was scared of Brandon's threats, scared of losing everything. I called Uncle Henry instead. He came over within minutes with the bar footage on a USB drive. We sat Mom down at the kitchen table and showed her everything. The journal entries I'd saved screenshots of, the security footage showing Brandon's movements, the witness statements he'd collected and had notarized. Mom threw up when she realized she'd been sleeping next to Dad's killer for months, that she'd been planning a wedding with him. She finally agreed to call the police. 2 detectives came to take our statements. They were professional but kind, offering Mom tissues and speaking gently to me. They listened to the recording of Brandon's confession multiple times. They watched the bar footage on our laptop. They took the journal as evidence, handling it carefully with gloved hands. One detective said they'd been having doubts about Dad's case anyway. The forensics had never quite added up, but the pressure to close the case had been intense. Brandon's confession filled in all the gaps. They put out an arrest warrant for Brandon that night, but he'd disappeared. His apartment was empty, cleaned out in a hurry. His car was gone. The police said not to worry, they'd find him. They put a patrol car outside our house just in case. Mom and I didn't sleep that night. We pushed the couch against the front door and sat in the living room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. The next morning, Uncle Henry called. He'd heard from his construction buddies that Brandon had been spotted at a motel 2 towns over, trying to pay cash for a room. The police were on their way. By noon, they had him in custody. He'd tried to run but didn't get far. They found evidence in his car linking him to the original murder weapon. He'd kept the actual knife all these years like some sick trophy, hidden in a lockbox in his trunk. The knife from the crime scene had been a decoy, but the real one still had traces of the victim's blood in the handle's crevices. Brandon tried to deny everything at first. He said I'd faked the recording using AI, that Mom was lying to protect me because she felt guilty about Dad, but the evidence was overwhelming. The bar footage showed him entering that bathroom. His fingerprints were on the real murder weapon once they tested it properly. The forensics that hadn't matched Dad suddenly made perfect sense when applied to Brandon. Even the angle of the wounds matched Brandon's height, not Dad's. Faced with everything, Brandon finally broke. He confessed fully in exchange for a plea deal. He admitted to planning the whole thing, to framing Dad, to manipulating Mom. He even admitted to things we didn't know about. Other crimes in other states, other victims who'd been blamed for things they didn't do. The detective said Brandon was a serial predator who'd been getting away with it for years, moving from place to place, always finding vulnerable women with kids. Dad's lawyer filed for an emergency appeal based on the new evidence. The judge reviewed everything and ordered Dad's immediate release. After 8 months in prison for a crime he didn't commit, Dad was coming home. Mom and I drove to pick him up. The ride was silent except for the radio playing softly. Mom kept crying, dabbing at her eyes with tissues. I didn't know what to say, my throat tight with emotion. When the prison gates opened and Dad walked out, he looked smaller than I remembered. Thinner, older, his hair more gray than brown now, but his eyes lit up when he saw me. I ran to him and hugged him tighter than I'd ever hugged anyone. He smelled different, like industrial soap and sadness, but he was still my dad. He held me and cried into my hair, whispering that he'd missed me so much, that he'd never stopped believing I'd know the truth. Mom stood back, unsure, wringing her hands. Dad looked at her for a long moment. Then he said they'd talk later, that right now he just wanted to go home. The drive back was quiet except for Dad asking small questions. How was school? Had I grown taller? Was my favorite restaurant still open? Normal Dad questions that felt anything but normal after everything we'd been through. We got home and Dad just stood in the doorway for a minute, looking around like he was memorizing everything. The house looked different without Brandon's stuff everywhere. Mom had thrown out anything he'd touched, leaving weird empty spaces on shelves and walls. Dad walked through each room slowly, running his fingers over furniture, picking up picture frames that Mom hadn't gotten around to replacing yet. That first night was awkward as hell. Dad slept on the couch even though Mom offered him their old bedroom. I heard him moving around at 3 a.m., probably couldn't sleep after months in a cell. I found him in the kitchen making coffee with shaking hands. We sat at the table in silence until he finally asked if I was okay. Really okay. I told him about Brandon, about everything. He listened without interrupting, his jaw getting tighter with each detail. When I finished, he said he was sorry he couldn't protect me. I told him it wasn't his fault. The next few days were a blur of lawyers and paperwork. Dad's lawyer was working on getting his record completely cleared, not just overturned. There was talk of compensation for wrongful imprisonment, but Dad said he didn't care about money. He just wanted his life back. Mom kept trying to talk to him, following him around the house, but he wasn't ready. He'd answer her questions with one word and find excuses to leave the room. Brandon's trial date was set for 6 months out. The prosecutor said with his confession and all our evidence, he'd probably get life without parole. They'd linked him to 3 other murders in different states, all with similar patterns. He'd frame someone close to the victim, then swoop in to comfort the grieving family. The detective said we were lucky, that his other victims hadn't survived to expose him. I went back to school, but everything felt different. Kids whispered when I walked by. Everyone knew about Brandon and Dad by now. Ashley stuck by me though, and a few other friends who actually mattered. My teachers were extra nice, which almost made it worse. I didn't want pity, I just wanted normal. But normal was gone, probably forever. Dad started working construction with Uncle Henry. Manual labor, he said, helped clear his head. He'd come home exhausted and covered in dust, but he seemed calmer. He was seeing a therapist too, some guy who specialized in wrongful conviction trauma. Dad didn't talk about the sessions, but I could see they were helping. He stopped flinching when doors slammed, stopped checking locks obsessively. Mom moved out after 2 weeks. She rented a small apartment across town, said she needed space to figure things out. I was relieved, honestly. The tension when her and Dad were in the same room was suffocating. She'd betrayed him in the worst way possible, even if Brandon had manipulated her. Some things you can't come back from. She asked if I wanted to stay with her sometimes, but I said no. I needed to be with Dad. The divorce papers came a month later. Dad signed them without reading them, just wanted it over. Mom gave him everything. The house, the car, full custody of me. Her guilt was eating her alive. She started seeing a therapist too, trying to understand how she'd been so blind. I felt bad for her sometimes, but then I'd remember how she chose Brandon over Dad, how she didn't believe me, and the sympathy would dry up. Uncle Henry became a regular at our house. He'd bring his kids over on weekends and we'd have cookouts like the old days. His twins, Elijah and John, were only 8, but they idolized Dad. They didn't care about his past, just that he could throw a football and tell funny stories. His daughter Deborah was my age and we got close fast. She understood what it was like to have your family turned upside down. Her mom had left when she was 10. 3 months after Dad got out, I had to testify at a pretrial hearing. The prosecutor said my testimony would help ensure Brandon couldn't claim insanity or coercion. I wore my nicest dress, the blue one Dad bought me for my birthday 2 years ago. My hands shook as I swore to tell the truth. Brandon sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, looking smaller than I remembered. He tried to catch my eye, but I stared straight ahead. I told them everything. About the threats, the touching, the night at the hotel. The judge had to call a recess when I talked about finding Dad's journal because I started crying too hard to continue. Dad wasn't allowed in the courtroom since he might be called as a witness later, but Uncle Henry was there. He gave me a thumbs up from the gallery, reminding me I was brave, that I could do this. Brandon's lawyer tried to make me look like a confused kid, asking if maybe I'd misunderstood Brandon's intentions. I stayed calm and repeated what happened, exactly as it happened. The prosecutor showed the recording from Ashley's phone, and Brandon's face went gray. His lawyer asked for a plea deal that afternoon, 25 to life instead of life without parole. The prosecutor said no way. After the hearing, reporters tried to talk to us outside the courthouse. Dad shielded me with his body as we pushed through them to Uncle Henry's truck. They shouted questions about forgiveness, about moving forward, about how it felt to see Brandon in chains. We didn't answer. There was nothing to say that would make them understand. This wasn't entertainment. It was our life. Mom started sending me letters, long rambling apologies about how she failed as a mother, how she should have seen the signs. I read the first few, then started throwing them away unopened. Dad said I should consider forgiving her eventually, for my own peace, not hers, but I wasn't ready. Maybe I'd never be ready. She'd chosen a monster over her own family. Some things are unforgivable. Brandon's actual trial was brutal. They brought in his other victims' families, showing pattern after pattern of his behavior. One woman from Arizona testified about how he dated her after her husband died in a suspicious accident. She'd gotten bad vibes and dumped him, probably saved her own life. Another family from Nevada talked about their son who was serving time for a murder that sounded exactly like Dad's case. The prosecutor said they were reopening that case too. Dad testified on day 3. He wore his only suit, the one from their wedding that he'd kept for some reason. He talked about finding the body, about trying to help, about the confusion when they arrested him. He talked about prison, about missing my birthday, about writing letters I'd never get to read. His voice broke when he talked about the day I was born, how he'd promised to always protect me and felt like he'd failed. Brandon took the stand on day 5, against his lawyer's advice. He tried to paint himself as a victim of circumstance, said the man in the bathroom had attacked him first. But under cross-examination, his story fell apart. He contradicted himself, got angry, showed his true face to the jury. When the prosecutor asked about his plans for me and Mom, he refused to answer. His own lawyer looked defeated. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Murder, conspiracy, fraud, attempted assault on a minor. The list went on. The judge sentenced him to life without parole, consecutive sentences for each crime. Brandon didn't react, just stared at the table. As they let him out, he looked at me one last time. I stared back, wanting him to see that he hadn't broken me, that I'd won. Dad and I went to his favorite restaurant after, the little Mexican place that still had his picture on the wall from when he was a regular. The owner hugged him and said the meal was on the house. We ate in comfortable silence, both exhausted but relieved. It was over. Really over. Brandon would die in prison and we could start rebuilding. Mom tried to come to the house the next week. Dad wouldn't let her in, talked to her through the screen door. She wanted to apologize again, wanted to try family counseling. Dad said no, that ship had sailed. She needed to move on, and so did we. She cried and begged, but Dad stood firm. I watched from the stairs, feeling nothing. She'd made her choice and now she had to live with it. I started seeing a therapist too, some lady named Dr. Cheryl who specialized in trauma. She helped me process everything, taught me it wasn't my fault, that I'd been incredibly brave. Some days I believed her, some days I didn't. But slowly, the nightmares stopped. I stopped checking locks obsessively, stopped flinching when men walked behind me. Progress came in small steps. Dad and I developed new routines. Sunday breakfast at the diner, Wednesday movie nights, helping Uncle Henry with projects on Saturdays. We talked more than we ever had before, about everything. School, friends, the future. He helped me with homework even though math wasn't his strong suit. He came to every school event, cheering too loud at my mediocre clarinet performances. We were learning how to be a family again, just the two of us. 6 months after the trial, Dad met someone. Carolyn, the bartender who testified, started coming around. First just as a friend, then something more. She made Dad laugh, real laughs, not the forced ones he'd been doing. I liked her. She didn't try to be my mom, just treated me like a person. She'd bring takeout and we'd watch bad movies, making fun of the plot holes. Dad smiled more when she was around. Mom eventually stopped trying to contact us. I heard from Ashley's mom that she'd moved to another state, starting fresh where nobody knew her story. Part of me hoped she'd find peace. Part of me didn't care. She'd been so easily fooled, so quick to replace Dad. Maybe Brandon had seen that weakness in her from the start. Maybe that's why he'd picked our family to destroy. A year after everything, Dad got a settlement from the state for wrongful imprisonment. Not millions, but enough to pay off the house and put money away for my college. He bought a new truck, took a vacation to the mountains, finally started living again. He kept working construction though, said he liked the honesty of it. You either built something right, or you didn't. No room for lies or manipulation. I turned 15 that spring. Dad threw me a big party, probably overcompensating for the birthdays he'd missed. Uncle Henry's family came. Carolyn was there. Even some kids from school showed up. We had a bounce house, which was ridiculous for teenagers, but nobody complained. Dad grilled burgers and told embarrassing stories about when I was little. For a few hours, we felt like a normal family having a normal party. That night, after everyone left, Dad and I cleaned up the yard in comfortable silence. He thanked me for believing in him, for never giving up. I told him I always knew he was innocent, that he wasn't capable of hurting anyone. He hugged me tight and said I'd saved his life. We both cried a little, but it was the good kind of tears. The healing kind. Life went on. I made honor roll, started dating a nice guy named Rory from my chemistry class. Dad threatened to clean his shotgun when Rory came over, but he was joking, mostly. Carolyn moved in after a year, bringing her cat Mr. Whiskers, who immediately claimed Dad's chair. We became a weird little family, built on shared trauma but held together by choice and love. Brandon died in prison 2 years later. Heart attack, the letter said. He was 43. I felt nothing when I read it, just closed the letter and went back to my homework. Dad asked if I was okay, and I said yeah, I really was. Brandon had been dead to me since the day they sentenced him. His actual death was just paperwork, nothing more. Mom sent a card for my 18th birthday. Just signed it, Love Mom, with no return address. I kept it for some reason, tucked in my desk drawer with other things I couldn't quite throw away. Dad said maybe someday I'd want to find her, make peace. Maybe he was right. Or maybe some bridges were meant to stay burned. Time would tell. I got into college on a full scholarship, planning to study criminal justice. Maybe become a lawyer, help other families torn apart by lies. Dad cried at graduation, embarrassing me in front of everyone. Carolyn took a million pictures while Uncle Henry's family cheered from the bleachers. My chosen family, the one that stood by me when everything fell apart. The night before I left for college, Dad and I sat on the porch swing, watching fireflies. He told me he was proud of me, that I'd become an amazing young woman despite everything. I told him I loved him, that he was the best dad anyone could ask for. We sat in comfortable silence. No need for more words. We'd survived the worst thing imaginable and came out stronger. That was enough. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found Dad's journal that night. If Brandon had succeeded in sending me away, if Mom had married him, if Dad had died in prison believing nobody cared. But I did find it. I did fight back. And sometimes that's all you can do. Fight for the truth and hope someone listens. In our case, they finally did.